Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome international TV journalist Nik Gowing.
Right. Lunch is awaiting after this, but we're keeping going on this.
Je sais que c'est le déjeuner qui arrive bientôt, mais on va continuer.
Where is energy coming from already across Africa? How much is there a new avenue, a new direction of travel? We've heard from Valerie a moment ago with exciting new details. We've also heard in the previous session about the enormity of the challenge, but where success is coming. Not just in Ghana, but also in India. There are different ways of now producing energy, and much of it is now becoming more sustainable and greener. You heard the ambition for 2020, that 10% of all energy produced in Ghana is going to be sustainable. Now, in the last 35 minutes before you do get lunch, I want to encourage you we're going to move in a different direction slightly. I'd like you to feel that when you're listening to the panelists, you can also send me an email, send me an idea of what's on your mind, because then I can make sure it goes to the panel in the limited time that we have available. We're going to have that email address there. Write it down, ask nyfa@gmail.com. It's a great way, if you're sitting there frustrated, of you getting a message to me and I can pick it up here. Limited time. What I'd like to do is ask the four panelists to introduce themselves, because actually they need to explain their qualifications for being on a panel about green being the color of business and success in Africa and where things are going. First, Peter Bellinger, normally in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Nick. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Ballinger. I'm with the U.S. government's development bank, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and we are one of the largest bilateral providers of finance and risk mitigation services to local and international investors in the clean energy sector. In the last 10 years, our portfolio in Africa has grown from 6% of the global portfolio to almost 30%. And the projects that we've supported here have the best payment record of any of the countries, and the clean energy projects which we have supported are the best performing, both grid connected and off-grid connected, or off-grid. I see the growth potential for the private sector and certainly for lenders like OPIC and other bilateral banks is in the off-grid sector. Maybe not in dollar volume or euro volume, but certainly in the number of projects.
Right, Peter, thanks for the moment. We'll come on to detail in a moment. Patrice FONLLADOSA, please, from Veolia.
Bonjour, mon nom est Patrice FONLLADOSA, donc je dirige les activités du groupe Veolia pour l'Afrique et le Moyen-Orient. J'ai aussi le privilège d'être le président du conseil d'administration de la Société des eaux et d'énergie du Gabon depuis quelques années. Une société qui apporte l'eau et l'énergie à l'ensemble de la population gabonaise. Nous sommes producteurs et distributeurs. Voilà, très simplement, je me permets par courtoisie d'adresser cette salle.
And therefore I am responsible for the electricity and water right here in Gabon. And also I am the president and general director of the electricity and water company in Gabon. And so we have a 1 billion CFA and the turnover right here in Gabon in terms of the redistribution of energy here in Gabon. So I'll be very happy to take on your questions. My name is...
Global solar power player. We have 500 megawatts in operation on 4 continents. We just joined the NG Group, formerly known as GTF Suez, and we have a very simple positioning to make solar power more competitive than other sources of energy. And we are presently generating power in Africa, in South Africa, cheaper, much cheaper than coal. Power as well in France, cheaper than nuclear. Power in Chile, cheaper than gas, and in India, cheaper than coal. We have a very strong conviction. Africa is going to lead in the next energy revolution, and that revolution is now.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. And finally, Harry VERHAAR from Philips.
Thank you, Nick. So I'm Harry VERHAAR. I work for Philips Lighting, so we are the leading global lighting company. We do a lot of work on energy efficiency, and we're actually in the midst of what we call an LED lighting revolution. We were founded, interestingly, when people in Europe got access to electricity a little over a century ago, and we also see the same relevance for Africa's development to work with you on solar LED solutions, smart connected lighting, so that you can both create socio-economic progress as well as do things smarter, more economically, and also better for our living environment.
Thank you all very much indeed. Now, Bob, if we can just put up that email address again and keep it up, so you can actually contribute, even if it's only 2 or 3 of you. It would be good to hear if there's something on your mind about the distinction between where things are at the moment and where things can go. We heard from one of the questions earlier, right at the beginning of the day, this frustration about where energy is coming from. There's one very important, there it is, the address. There's one very important message which all 4 of our guests come with. It's about what value does the grid have? Or is there a completely new concept emerging? And all of you, I think, are in agreement. But Peter Ballinger, again, I want to hear from all 4 of you about where you're seeing the value or not of the old idea of a grid.
We're going to continue to support grid-connected projects, but the real growth area in Africa are the communities that are, in all reality, never going to be grid-connected. And many of them are prosperous agricultural areas that are already producing power. They're doing it with generators and diesel fuel at very high costs. So entrepreneurs, both local and from outside of Africa, see a tremendous opportunity in providing off-grid clean energy power to these communities. They're willing to pay. The marriage of power production and mobile telephony, which is very sophisticated in Africa, to pay the bills means that entrepreneurs can measure their cash flow, which makes the project much more bankable than, say, a larger traditional power project where you're selling into the national grid.
So it's very much in line with what Bunker Roy was saying about the Indian experience. Patrice, the value now of the grid, or how are things moving?
Alors les choses en fait évoluent d'une manière qui est assez surprenante. Ça a été d'ailleurs évoqué par l'un des...
What we've been able to see was mentioned by one of our panelists, and this is my neighbor on the left, is that we have a sort of a historical view of the meeting the electrical needs on the African continent. Is sort of a copy of what's been happening in the United States and Europe, because the Africans, they've been doing incredible things in terms of mobile telephones. In other words, they've skipped over years of development. They didn't have fixed telephones, and they went directly into the new types of most recent developments in telephones. And so now what they're doing is they're talking about the storing of energy sources. And so today we don't have to have these extremely costly networks for the different electrical sources. What you can do is have these new energies, which is partly wind power, partly solar power. And so the development of these different sources and the industry in terms of the need for energy is completely being changed. And I think that the new developers in Africa are taking this into consideration, and they're absorbing some of these new technologies much more quickly than other continents.
So the key phrase here is off-grid. Thierry.
We need the grid. The grid is system, the grid is sharing power, sharing consumption. The grid is being smart. What is changing is that the grid is no longer a national grid, it can be a local grid, but the grid is absolutely essential.
So you're talking about a village grid or a town grid, a community grid?
We think the grid can be, the smallest we would see would be for 50,000 people. We don't think that you can be economical if you have grid sizes which are too small. Which means that here in Africa, we have cities, and cities are going to be the driver for this energy revolution. We're confident that the countryside, rural electrification has a great potential, but the country, and Gabon here is a country of cities. Cities are going to lead the way, and those grids need to be seen as smart city grids.
Let me just check with Patrice and Peter. 50,000, is that what you mean by a smaller grid, Patrice?
Yeah, Well, it depends country per country, I believe, and sorry, it depends country per country, and I believe that, of course, when you're talking about this sizable grid, it's because you have been basing your economical model on it. This may not include some different phase, like not only solar, but also I was talking about some micro-hydraulic model, which can be really integrated and put on the necessary national grid.
Peter, grid, is that the kind of size you're talking about?
Good number.
50,000 helps make the project bankable, although they may all not be connected together. There may be multiple smaller grids that are part of one project, but 50,000 is a very good size.
Harry, this grid issue.
Yeah, well, interestingly, I think when people have access to energy, be it grids or non-grids, so off-grids, we need both. You see that the first service they acquire is lighting, and because that allows you to lengthen the day for education, small-sized economic activities. And we do see there that of the 1.1 billion people across the world and 700 million in Africa who are off-grid, that's although the percentage of people that are off-grid will go down, that for Africa until 2030, the 700 million people off the grid will remain fairly stable. So we see there as our mission, what we call to eradicate light poverty. And for these people, they will be connected to off-grid, solar, LED, and also other solutions powered by solar and wind. It's also much more economical because of the geography. If you imagine that connecting to the grid costs about $4,000 per household, but a solar lantern costs 20, then we see we need both, but we also need to be seeing, okay, where do we apply what?
All right, you're already stimulating questions. Remember that the email address is asknyfa@gmail.com. Let me begin to flow them to you. This one from Ellis Tulton. We talk about electricity shortages, but what about fuel shortages? Does green energy offer a solution to improving Africa's refineries and domestic fuel supply? Peter. And maybe move the microphone closer to you, Kenny.
I would say it does. The more people consume clean energy, whether off-grid or on-grid, the less need there is for heavy fuel oil, which is expensive, it's dirty, and has to be transported, unlike clean energy.
Thierry.
Well, I think power is the future. Fuel will be seen as a transitional energy source. What you are seeing today is cars being increasingly powered through electricity. What you're seeing is electricity being the method of choice, and we think that Africa is going to be the country of the continent of electricity. It's going to be jump-starting this thing. I don't think we're going to see dozens of millions of cars, diesel cars, as we have in Europe, for instance. Africa, even if that sounds a bit early, will move to a world of electricity. And there again, solar is a massive resource. It's local, it's everywhere. It is today cheaper than coal and gas. And most importantly, it can be deployed very quickly. So this electrical revolution that is transferring energy uses into power, which Patrice was talking about leapfrogging. If there's one thing that Africa will leapfrog is in the use of electricity, which we think is the most convenient source of use for buildings and transportation.
So are we saying, Patrice, that Ellis Tolton's question is interesting, but is already showing the legacy that has to be overcome, this assumption about fuel and shortages?
Yeah, let me give you my insight, a true belief is that, and there is a picture here which is very interesting. A big dam here is on the wall. Of course, solar, wind can be envisaged, but the reality is that the continent itself has already an unemployed, unexploited today potential of really hydraulic, which exists. If we talk about, for example, here, this country in Gabon, there are projects which are under review today at the government level to try to secure new dams and new hydraulic possibilities. There was some kind of probably, I would say, cautious about the utilization of the hydraulic resource in former years. This is fading away, and there are now a lot of projects which, of course, need to be secured by heavy financing, but donors are ready to finance such kind of thing. Money is not really the issue, but much more the model of distributing, producing and distributing.
There are a lot of questions coming in. Keep them coming. We've got about 20 minutes. Fascinating, many of these. Let me pick up, Harry, do you want to pick up on that? Because there's one directly in your direction.
Yeah, I'd like to give one example because I fully agree. So this will be the continent of electrified services. But to give you one example of how moving away from fossil fuel can be beneficial is that in the continent, those people who are off the grid, they spend $20 billion a year on kerosene for lighting. If you would move them over to solar LED lighting solution, it is a one-time cost of 3 to 5 billion. And then indeed, the money can be spent on education, healthcare, and other things that are really crucial to socio-economic progress. So just to give in a few numbers.
An interesting question here from Matthew Smith. Actually, all the questions are very interesting. The chief executive of École Rouban VERHAAR here in Libreville. But it goes to the next generation and what the next generation is going to expect. How do we create sustained learning about green energy for the children, I would say the youth, the next generation of the region? And we've heard the kind of levels of people who are simply not getting enough energy at the moment. How do you recreate the education system and awareness of what is possible? What's your experience, Thierry?
I'm going to be very blunt. Green power is not for the next generation. It is for today's generation. And we've had thousands of school children visiting our solar parks in France and other places. And we're very proud of working with school teachers and everything in bringing that to their awareness. Yet, what is absolutely fundamental is that this is not the energy of the future. And this is something that has to change. Africa is not the continent of the future. Solar is not the energy of the future. Africa is the continent of today, and solar is the energy of today. There again, what needs to be done is massive investment, and teaching is something. What children need, in my opinion, is inspiration. If you are inspired by what you see, not by bedtime stories about an ideal future that nobody will see, but about actual things being built, about adults moving, I think that's what children would need, and this is what we're doing in various countries.
Harry, what have you learned in Philips? Because after all, you've been trying to educate every generation about going from the incandescent light bulb to the LED. That's been a major commercial commitment by you, but also it's about the change of technology and assumptions. What have you learned about familiarization, embracing of new technology?
Yeah. So I would say, if you maybe jumping on the inspirational part. So you could see that in current OECD countries, it took about 3 generations to move from getting access to energy services, electricity service, and then being as prosperous as we are today. Education and added to that capacity building are really key because we need to do this in 1 generation, also because of the global requirements. And there are 3 factors at play. So one is inspiration, actually to look through let's say, not seeing this as a problem, but as an opportunity, and seeing that actually when doing this, we're economically, environmentally smarter, but we're creating a lot of social benefits. But then after inspiration, we need also aspiration. How much are we going to do by when? So for us, it means eradicating light poverty by 2030, but there is much more that we need to do. And the third factor is perspiration. So rolling up our sleeves, creating the partnerships, and making this happen. And I think these 3 words, they work both in English as in Spanish, or in French, Spanish as well, and then inspiration, aspiration, and perspiration, and getting it done. And I think in the last part, partnerships are key. Partnerships for education, partnerships for capacity building, partnerships on a sectoral level, and many more.
What are you learning, Peter and Patrice, from your experience about how you get the generations, whichever generation, to understand the enormity of change that's needed? Peter?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to point to this project here, Gigawatt Global, which is in Rwanda. A solar project, 8.5 megawatts, a European, Rwandan, US joint venture. The important thing about this project is the employment that it created, people who were underemployed in the agricultural sector. They finished the plant very quickly. They had no skills when they started. They're now going on to work on other projects. So it's not just the students who are learning and being inspired, but it's also the underemployed talent in the local communities. And that plant, unlike that plant, was up and running within about 13 months from beginning, financial close, and commissioning. So as Thierry and I have discussed, these clean energy projects, particular solar, can come on stream very quickly, and that's what's needed.
Patrice, again, changing the mindsets at every generation. What's your experience so far in Africa?
Well, changing the mindset is something which that you have to take from the ground, which really means taking this from the primary school education. That is very much embedded in the habits for the water sector, but it's starting, in fact, for the energy sector. And when you look at and you compare, like in Veolia, as you may know, we are also a water and wastewater operator. We understood that in Africa in particular, energy is really the #1 issue. You can't make things working without energy at all. This education has to start in the school, in the partnership with universities, and this is something which now is really rolling, at least for Veolia Capital.
Because Sean from Youngstars has just sent me a message which builds on all of this. One of the young people here, how are the African youth integrated into green energy programs? Picking up your point, I think, Thierry, that it's now, not in 10 years' time. And how do we build awareness of green energy, not just among the generations, but particularly in rural communities? What's your experience?
Like I gave one example, so also where energy is connected to health. So we have a program called Community Light Centers, where we provide actually solar LED lighting for communities, but then with a little extra power, so that also in local health clinics, medical equipment can be powered, vaccines can be refrigerated. And we see that actually in many rural communities, particularly women when they are pregnant, there's no electricity in a rural health clinic, if at all there's a clinic. So they go to regional or further, and a lot of women, they die before giving birth. And we now see in a number of projects that we're doing in Africa that by providing energy, by providing lighting, that actually the health service in itself, they are vastly improved. So, and also the mortality rate is significantly reduced. So
Thierry, looking at that solar, and you're in solar, not just in Africa, but around the world. Again, education, familiarization.
There's, I'm going to use a French word. It is essential to turn these projects into territorial projects, i.e. community projects. Our experience in France, but has been the case in South Africa, in India, and other countries, is that if you build institutions, we've done, for instance, joint ventures with local governments in France and other countries. If you turn that into a source of empowerment, so that it's not just a large company just developing a project and bringing, some added benefits by sort of charity work, but you turn these communities into the true owners of these installations. It changes everything. And by the way, what you have here is development, and development comes with jobs. But the key there is to have what we in France, and this is what Ségolène Royal is really specialist of, this territorial vision of having initiatives where solar and other energy initiatives can be brought together by local governments and local NGOs, among others.
The principals, Peter and Patrice, anything to add on that? Not particularly? Okay, all right, well, let's move on. Finance, which is your area, Peter. From Yves Mutiganda, in terms of financing, which types of green projects could be put in place and are more affordable and don't add to the government deficit? In other words, when you look at a project like that, the kind of thing that Thierry is involved in, or some of the other sustainable projects like the turbines over there, the financing of it.
Well, almost all of the projects that we're looking at here are owned and operated by the private sector. So government definitely gains by having a legal infrastructure, by enhancing their capacity to attract investment, understanding what international investors need to be able to mobilize the capital in the international and African capital markets to implement these projects. But all of these projects that we're looking at come at no cost to the government, other than they have to create the grid to be able to take the power. So the public-private partnership in generation is very key, grid connected, to Africa's development in the energy sector.
Patrice, is that your experience too?
Well, I think if you look at this one, at the project itself, we don't have the same cost value as this one, which is a dam here. And when you're looking to very large project which needs big capex, there is no doubt that a government, a state, has a much better access to low-cost financing than the private sector. Meaning, in fact, that the model today, which really we encourage and we believe has a real future in Africa, but not only in the world, is to have an asset company, an operating company. The asset company, owned by the government or being majority owned by the government, is financing the long-term infrastructure, like this one. It's really a question of size of investment, but it's a blend exercise in which the PPP, the public-private partnership, is really a delimitation of respective roles of who is doing what. Mainly for us, I believe, as a private operator, we believe that government, long-term, I would say, owner of the assets have to finance them and being remuneration on operation, performance, bonus and penalties on the long run.
Thierry, is that your experience? The key role of government for solar?
Now, I think government can be interesting in what I described as the community involvement. Now, government involvement in finance should be avoided at any cost. We have a very strong conviction. Subsidies are poisonous. Subsidies, wherever they exist, are transforming the behaviors of market players and should be avoided. We, as a solar company, perform best in Chile, where there is no subsidy whatsoever. I inaugurated our first solar park with the Chilean Minister of Energy. I said, Mr. Minister, thank you. Thank you for not having any subsidies, any program whatsoever. We think, though, that government is needed for the rules, for the frameworks, and what the likes of OPICs are doing is absolutely essential.
Are governments being enlightened enough, though, given the pace of change that is needed? Are they being enlightened enough, governments, in their approach?
An amazing amount of work is being done by OPIC, by the World Bank, by the IDB, by a number of banks, helping government, as we speak right now, to structure the right, as we call in our industry, PPAs, the right structure of power purchase agreements, the right legal environment, the right regulatory environment so that investors, private investors, pension funds, can be secured about the quality of their investment over 20, 30, 40 years. That replaces massively subsidies. Subsidies go the wrong way, incentivize the wrong projects, incentivize the wrong behaviors. Now, if you have transparent rules, and what we are seeing, and we are extremely optimistic, we're seeing today Egypt, we're seeing Jordan, we're seeing Latin American countries adopting that. We know that a lot of work is right now being done with many African countries. This is the key to opening a deluge of investment, of private investment into these infrastructures and change the face of what we describe African infrastructure.
Harry VERHAAR, government, private.
Yeah. I think when you talk about financing, it's important to recognize what are we trying to fix. And I think what we're trying to fix is that we have created a society that is very much focused on lowest initial cost. So we install all those inefficient appliances, we build all those inefficient buildings. So it's really important that we start looking at their whole life cycle perspective. And it means that if you look at it financially, that indeed those more sustainable solutions are cheaper, and actually they provide more returns than installing inefficient solutions. But it also means if you look at the public environment, public stakeholders, it requires that financing goes hand in hand with procurement. And then with, you could call it performance-based procurement or green procurement, but where the whole life cycle performance is taken into account. And we find then, when we look at cities and when we look at rural communities, that there's more than money enough and financiers enough. So we work with the multilateral development banks, we work with private banks, French banks, and they're more than happy to invest and to finance citywide, city-scale projects on lighting, on infrastructure, roads. It's not just rural communities. So the money is not the problem, but it's the way that we design things. So really look at it performance-based, and then indeed we make the right decisions, and there's money enough.
We've got 10 minutes to run, so if you've got other points you want to raise, then please do. We've got a bit of time still. But this raises a question which Jean-Michel Lavoisard has put to you. It's all very well, but how do we solve the issue of corruption in these high-spending areas of energy and infrastructure? Is this a drag? Is it an obstacle? Or is it something that can be overcome? Patrice, what's your experience here?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Well, I'll put the question as it's written here. How do we solve the issue of corruption in the high-spending areas of energy and infrastructure? Is that going to be an obstacle to the enormous potential that green has?
Now, maybe one example when my colleagues are thinking, when you think about corruption, then you know that in the end, that if you do things following business principles, in the end everybody wins. And there's one example on my mind, is Singapore. So 50, 60 years ago, Singapore was a very poor country. And you can see that they started doing things right. They had a vision of how the future would be more beneficial, but also they are very adamant on anti-corruption. And you see now that actually they are one of the most prosperous countries in the world. So I think if those design principles are taken into account, you will recognize if you reduce corruption, in the end, everybody wins.
Peter, do you see those design principles being developed in your experience across Africa? Singapore is one small country of 5 million people. It's not Africa.
Yeah. Well, one point I'd like to make about corruption is in the smaller clean energy projects, whether they're on-grid or off-grid, there is less corruption. There's less opportunity to steal or to interfere with the project than there are with larger infrastructure projects. I think also the lenders, through the covenants, are making it much more difficult for governments to use corruption to make the project less efficient. And I think that people are beginning to hold their governments accountable because there is a demand for power. But I think clean energy, we're seeing much less corruption, probably because there's less opportunity to steal.
Patrice.
Yeah, just for the sake of it, I'm not very fond of having all the time this question of corruption linked to Africa. Because as being in a company which is running worldwide operations, this is something which
it's
is
not being linked
everywhere.
to Africa, it's about
yeah,
these areas
I'm making
of
here
energy and infrastructure.
On the energy infrastructure, or any kind of infrastructure, this is something which may be solved, and most of the time is really solved by the appropriate governance. Governance being transparency, but also accountability. Being capable of being totally and fully transparent on the way that tenders are rolled out and operations are run. And I think this is something which I believe mean a very light grant openness in the way that you conduct the business, in the way that you conduct your tenders, that you award your contracts.
Thierry, do you think this is an issue or not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fundamental issue. I always remember what Mo Ibrahim said when he started at Celtel. He said that I want to make sure that not one of my companies is involved in corruption activities. And he found a way to develop business in 15 African countries and brought mobile phones to millions of Africans, and that set the waves. We think that the right way of doing it is just by saying no. And the best way is precisely what I was describing before. If you have many players, if you have open competition, if you have very clear frameworks, if you have transparent tenders, and guess what? Today, the place where we have this at the best, it will surprise many people, is India. Much more transparent, for instance, in France. The way tenders are done in France, I'm going to be very clear, is something that would not be accepted in India. India has extremely transparent when it comes to solar. When it comes to solar, I'm not talking about what happened in India in the past and what happens in other things, but I can testify we've built 200 megawatts in India, and we've seen how it is done. We think that there are ways of doing it today that are clean and that generate massive amount of investment precisely because of that.
All right, we've got 5 minutes to run. Let me give you a question which in many ways you've partially answered from Cedric Atangana, one of the top 50 African startups. But it's seeking the model for how this development is going to take place. Let me quote what he said. The centralized energy infrastructure has shown its limits in Europe, America, and Asia. Very expensive, very dangerous sometimes, like nuclear. Don't you think that letting people build their own energy will be better than trying to centralize and control everything in a national grid? Now, you've all partially answered that, but it's about this self-starting from within communities. How is that going to be achieved? Peter.
Well, I would say one of our more innovative projects is a finance company that is offering household finance for people who can purchase their own solar panels and install that system or systems in their area. So they have the ability and the income actually to purchase it. What they need is to stretch the tenor of that loan.
Do they have to create a small company, a small partnership?
No. It's a household finance, basically. But, and I think we've provided $50 million to start, working with local financial institutions, but the proceeds of this loan has to be used to help people install energy efficient or clean energy solutions off-grid. They know the market. We've extended the tenor. They can recycle these dollars as people help. But what is missing in the household is the upfront income to capitalize that purchase. So this is addressing that need in a way that a local bank wouldn't be able to take that risk, doesn't understand that risk. And I think that's going to be quite revolutionary, is helping people finance what they need in their homes, in their communities.
But Thierry, with something like a solar farm, or however you want to describe it, is that doable within a community?
Energy is serious business, it's mass business, it's industry. If you want individuals to do it, you will add cost and add complexity. We think that decentralized doesn't mean individual, it means collective. It means bringing communities together. There again, getting back to these 50,000, we have a vision at Solairedirect. We've built 40 solar parks in France, which are municipal solar parks. We're right now doing that in other geographies. We think that is the right scale. People need to cooperate with each other, and these territorial initiatives are the way to do it. Individual initiatives are nice, but they will not change the face of energy, especially versus large centralized organizations that today implement fossil fuels, for instance.
So keyword there, collective, Harry.
I think the mistake we are making with thinking grid connected is actually that we think in the, in the old model of being connected with hardware. So we can probably, we think we can only be a utility customer when we are connected to the grid. We have our music in albums and CDs at home. We had a physical connection in the past with our banks. I think when you look at a connected world, a software world, then I would also, I'm involved in a project, the future of electricity of the World Economic Forum. And there you also see utilities are thinking customers are grid connected, we are selling electricity. But also if utilities would see that people who are off-grid and are solar LED connect, let's say have solar LED and other solutions, they can do mobile payments. Why can't they be customers of the utilities of the future? Why can't these utilities finance their energy services and then have more future prospective customers? I would say we need to go from the hardware to the software connected thinking, and there's then a lot of potential in doing things mobile, capacity building, education, having a customer relationship.
Patrice, anything?
Yeah, we may have swept something which is quite important here, probably. It's the difference between the urban situation and the rural situation. In urban situation, you can find any, I would say, lonely solutions, which would be just for one people or family or something like that. There is a big difference for me in the solution which may be provided locally out of grid, but in rural areas, and the consideration of really being much more in a collective way of looking at these questions in urban areas. And don't forget that 60%, more than that, in fact, 60% by the 2020 of the population is progressively going in towns and urbanization. So trying to find some solutions which are really backed up on individual people is something which may be looked at very carefully.
Right. We've got literally a couple of minutes, so I'll just give you two questions, both on technology and where the cutting edge is at the moment. First from John Kidenda, what are your thoughts on the cost trajectory of energy storage technology given new developments like the Tesla Gigafactory? Will battery packs dominate, or will other storage technologies be necessary for renewable energy to succeed and dominate? And this from Ed Packshaw. What is the most exciting and realistic new green technology that you feel will shape the future of clean energy in Africa? So in your last minute, can I ask you to address whichever of those you'd like? Peter.
Well, I would say in storage technology, there have been advances. I don't know about in rural areas, but for example, we're doing a project in South Africa, concentrated solar, which is using molten salt. So they're actually producing and saving energy during the day when the sun is shining, and then they're selling power into the grid in the evening, which is a first for solar energy. I think some of the newer technologies are being developed in what I would call island nations. Mauritius is looking at bringing cold, deep water in through pipes, using heat transfer into buildings that are already prepared to take this in air conditioned. So there are a lot of new technologies like that that are, I think, very exciting.
There is no doubt that for me, the revolution is here. Storage is a very big revolution for the future. I am sure that nobody will see the energy distribution the same way with the increased capacity of having the store of energy like it is done, for example, in water. This will change very much the way that operations, but also CapEx is going to be invested in the years to come.
Thierry.
I think storage is extremely promising long term, but in most places we don't need it today. We can generate today massive amounts of variable wind and solar power without recurring to storage in most geographies. And technology-wise, I just like to point out, and there again, obviously I'm a solar guy, what you're seeing there is the technology has been unchanged for 60 years. We're talking about photovoltaics. It's the only electronics source of energy, and something everyone should have in mind. There are mechanical source of energy, turbines, that's everything. That goes from hydro to thermal to other energy sources. Photovoltaics has a Moore's law, so it's going to be incredibly inexpensive, and is already inexpensive, but it's going to be more cheaper and cheaper, massively cheaper. That's something to take into account if you plan the development of an energy mix in local geography.
Harry, last word.
Yeah, so I'm really inspired by the progress in smartphones, renewable energy, various sorts, but also intelligent appliances and lighting for cities and buildings. I think if you look at those, they're empowering progress. They're not only more economical, but they provide a better service and quality of life. And I think if we embrace those with sufficient ambition level, then the future is bright.
Thank you very much indeed. Bright indeed. Thank you, Harry. So thank you for your stamina. Thanks for your patience. It's lunchtime, and the task forces will begin. But what you've heard there, much more of it going off-grid with the green successes, and also the view that it's going to be collective, not necessarily community or government or private, collective. Those are some of the key takeaways. The task forces begin at 2:30. Thank you, and thank you to our panel.